The icy Chicago rain was already soaking through Madeline's thin coat when the roar of high-performance engines shattered the dead-of-night silence. She had just lost everything: her career, her reputation, her only way to keep her younger sister in college, fired from Cook County Hospital over a vicious, calculated lie. She was just an exhausted civilian walking home through the desolate concrete canyons of Lower Wacker Drive. Then, the blinding halogen headlights hit her. 5 matte black supercars, armored Mercedes G-Wagons, and a low-slung Aston Martin DBS swerved with brutal precision, barricading the street and pinning her against the damp concrete wall. Heavy doors flew open. Armed men stepped out into the downpour. A towering man with fresh blood, soaking his bespoke suit, marched straight toward her, his voice a lethal command echoing in the dark. "Where is the nurse?" The fluorescent lights of the Cook County Hospital trauma ward always had a way of washing the color out of a person's skin. But tonight, Madeline Hayes looked paler than usual. It was 2:14 a.m. on a brutal November Tuesday, and she was 14 hours into what was supposed to be a 12-hour shift. Madeline was arguably the most skilled trauma nurse on the floor. At 28, she had the kind of razor-sharp medical instincts that took most physicians a decade to develop. She had spent her early 20s scrubbing into chaotic surgical theaters at Johns Hopkins before moving back to Chicago to care for her sister, Chloe. Tonight, that intuition was the only thing keeping a 22-year-old car crash victim from flatlining. "Push another milligram of epinephrine," Madeline barked, her hands applying steady, unrelenting pressure to the young man's crushed sternum. "His pressure is tanking. We're losing the rhythm." "Doctor?" Aris said to wait for the attending. Maddie, a younger nurse, stammered, holding the syringe with trembling fingers. "If we wait for Aris, this kid is leaving in a bag. Push it. Now," Madeline commanded. The younger nurse flinched but pushed the medication into the IV line. Within seconds, the erratic blaring of the heart monitor stabilized into a steady, rhythmic beep. Madeline let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, wiping a strand of damp, dark hair from her forehead with the back of her sterile glove. She had saved a life. It was what she did. It was the only thing she knew how to do perfectly. But the triumph was fleeting. Before Madeline could even strip off her bloody gloves, the double doors of Trauma Bay 4 swung open. Dr. Gregory Aris, the chief of surgery, a man whose impeccably tailored scrubs and heavily gelled hair seemed entirely out of place in a public hospital, stood in the doorway. His eyes were cold, completely ignoring the stabilized patient on the table. "Nurse Hayes," Aris said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "My office. Immediately." A cold knot formed in Madeline's stomach. She knew that tone. She stripped off her PPE, washed her hands in the stainless steel sink, and followed him down the sterile, linoleum-tiled hallway. Dr. Aris's office was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of the ward outside. As Madeline stepped in, she noticed another figure standing by the window, a man in a cheap grey suit holding a clipboard. "Human Resources." "Sit down, Madeline," Aris said, not offering her the courtesy of looking her in the eye. He sat behind his massive desk and folded his hands. "Is this about the epinephrine?" Madeline asked, keeping her posture straight. The patient was coding. "You were 3 minutes out," and his vitals. "This is not about your cowboy antics in the trauma bay," Aris interrupted, his tone laced with venom. He slid a clear plastic evidence bag across the polished wood of his desk. Inside were 3 empty glass vials. "This is about the 75 milligrams of fentanyl missing from the level 3 lockbox. The lockbox that, according to the digital logs, was last accessed by your badge." Madeline stared at the bag, the air instantly leaving her lungs. "That's impossible. I haven't been in the level 3 dispensary all night. I've been in Bay 4 for the last 6 hours. The system says otherwise," the HR representative chimed in, his voice devoid of emotion. "We also found 2 more empty vials in your locker during a routine sweep 20 minutes ago." "My locker?" Madeline's voice rose, panic finally piercing her composed exterior. "You searched my locker? I didn't take anything. You know I didn't. I don't even have a key to the secondary narcotics lock." "Someone did," Aris said smoothly. "And frankly, Nurse Hayes, your financial struggles are not a secret around here. We know you're paying out of pocket for your sister's tuition at Northwestern. People get desperate. They steal. They sell things on the street. Are you out of your mind?" Madeline slammed her hands on the desk, the injustice burning through her veins like battery acid. This is a setup. You're framing me. This is because of what happened on Thursday, isn't it? The patient who died in recovery room B. Thomas Sterling. I saw his chart, Aris. I saw that he was given a lethal dose of potassium, and I told you about it. I told you someone tampered with his line. Aris's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine menace breaking through his bureaucratic facade. Thomas Sterling wasn't just a patient. He was a well-connected real estate developer with ties to Chicago's deeply entrenched organized crime rings. Madeline had noticed the discrepancy in his chart, the fatal error that looked too deliberate to be a mistake. She had brought it to Aris, expecting an investigation. Instead, she got silence. "You are hysterical, Madeline," Aris said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Thomas Sterling died of a massive myocardial infarction. That is the official coroner's report. And as of this exact moment, your employment at Cook County Hospital is terminated. Effective immediately. You can't do this." "I have already done it," Aris replied, leaning back in his leather chair. "HR will escort you out. I am legally obligated to report this theft to the State Board of Nursing. Your license will be suspended pending investigation. If you go quietly, I might be persuaded not to call the Chicago Police Department and have you walk out of here in handcuffs." Madeline felt the room spinning. Her nursing license wasn't just a piece of paper. It was her entire identity. It was the roof over her and Chloe's heads. It was the food on their table. To lose it, and to face criminal charges for something she didn't do, was a death sentence. "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound defeat. "Clean out your locker, Miss Hayes. You have 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, Madeline found herself standing in the employee parking garage, clutching a small cardboard box containing a stethoscope, a few faded photographs, and a favorite coffee mug. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her in heavy, suffocating waves. She was broke. She was blacklisted. She walked over to her 2009 Honda Civic, a battered silver sedan that had seen better days. She tossed the box into the passenger seat, slid behind the wheel, and turned the key. Click, click, click. The engine refused to turn over. The alternator had been dying for weeks, and now, perfectly timed with the absolute worst night of her life, it had finally given up. Madeline dropped her forehead against the cold steering wheel. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. She checked her phone. 3 a.m. Her bank account app showed a balance of $142.50. A tow truck would cost at least $100. A cab to her small apartment in the South Loop would be $30. She had no choice. She zipped up her thin, waterproof jacket, grabbed her backpack, and walked out of the garage into the freezing Chicago rain. The rain was relentless, driven sideways by the biting wind rolling off Lake Michigan. Madeline pulled her hood up, shivering violently as she navigated the empty, rain-slicked sidewalks. To save time, she took a detour down the concrete ramp leading to Lower Wacker Drive. Lower Wacker was a subterranean labyrinth of multi-level streets that ran beneath the glittering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. During the day, it was a bustling, chaotic artery for delivery trucks and commuters. At 3:30 a.m., it was a desolate, echoing concrete cave bathed in the sickly orange glow of sodium vapor lights. The air smelled of damp asphalt, ozone, and old exhaust. Puddles the size of small ponds collected in the sunken drains, and the only sound was the hollow dripping of water from the ceiling beams. Madeline kept her head down, her wet sneakers squelching against the pavement. Her mind raced with desperate calculations. How would she pay rent? How would she tell Chloe that the tuition check was going to bounce? Who could she call for legal help against a hospital that had millions of dollars and a corrupt chief of surgery on its side? She was so lost in her spiraling thoughts that she didn't hear the hum of the engines until they were right on top of her. It didn't sound like normal city traffic. It was a deep, guttural, synchronized roar that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. Madeline froze, turning her head just as a blinding array of LED headlights flooded the dark tunnel. They came out of nowhere. A matte black Lamborghini Urus roared around the concrete pillar to her left, its tires screeching against the wet pavement as it swerved violently to cut off her path forward. Before she could take a step back, a heavily armored Cadillac Escalade slammed on its brakes directly behind her. To her right, A second Urus and another Escalade boxed her in against the solid concrete wall of the tunnel. And then, gliding through the center of the mechanical blockade like a shark cutting through the water, was a sleek, midnight blue Aston Martin DBS. Madeline backed up until her shoulders hit the freezing concrete wall. Her breath hitched in her throat. This wasn't a mugging. Muggers didn't drive millions of dollars worth of exotic, custom-armored steel. The doors of the SUVs burst open in unison. 8 men stepped out into the rain. They were entirely dressed in black, moving with a terrifying, synchronized military precision. They didn't shout. They didn't draw weapons, though the heavy bulges beneath their tailored coats made it obvious they were armed to the teeth. They simply formed a perimeter, cutting off every conceivable avenue of escape. Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her medical training kicked in, analyzing the threat, flight or fight. But there was nowhere to run, and fighting a private army was suicide. The driver's side door of the Aston Martin opened slowly. The man who stepped out was tall, easily over 6'2", with broad shoulders accentuated by a bespoke charcoal suit. Even in the dim, orange light of the tunnel, he radiated a terrifying kind of authority. His dark hair was slicked back by the rain, and his jawline was sharp enough to cut glass. But it wasn't his intimidating presence that made Madeline's stomach drop. It was the stark, crimson red covering his hands and the cuffs of his white dress shirt. Blood. Fresh, arterial blood. He didn't look at his men. He walked straight toward Madeline, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a piercing, unwavering intensity. He stopped 2 feet away, the rain dripping from his jaw. "Where is the nurse?" he demanded. His voice was a low, rough baritone that commanded absolute obedience. Madeline swallowed hard, pressing herself flat against the wall. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just walking home." The man took half a step closer. The smell of copper and iron washed over her, mixing with the scent of expensive cologne. "Don't lie to me." My men tracked the cell phone ping. "You just walked out of Cook County Hospital. You are Madeline Hayes." Madeline's eyes widened. How did he know her name? "Who are you?" "My name is Roman Cassell," he said, the words carrying a weight that felt dangerously heavy. Even Madeline, who avoided the local news, knew the name Cassell. The Cassell family was Chicago royalty, but not the kind that ended up in society magazines. They were the architects of the city's underground, a massive, ruthless syndicate that controlled everything from high-end illegal gambling rings to the private shipping docks on the lake. They were ghosts, urban legends whispered about, but rarely seen in the flesh. And Roman Cassell was the head of the family. "I need a trauma nurse," Roman stated, his eyes flicking to the bloody hands resting at his sides. "And I was told, you are the best one in this city." "I'm not a nurse anymore," Madeline stammered, the fresh wound of her firing suddenly burning anew. "I was fired an hour ago. My license is suspended. You need to let me go." "I know you were fired," Roman said smoothly, stepping entirely into her personal space. "I also know why you were fired. Gregory Aris framed you because you saw the potassium burn on Thomas Sterling's arm. Sterling was one of my men. Aris belongs to a rival family. You were collateral damage, Madeline. A loose end they tied up." Madeline stared at him, the pieces of the nightmare suddenly locking into place. The missing fentanyl, the HR rep waiting at 2 a.m. It wasn't just a corrupt doctor covering his tracks. She had stumbled into the middle of a Mafia turf war. "If you know that," Madeline breathed, her voice trembling, "then you know I have nothing to do with this. Please, just let me walk away." "I can't do that," Roman replied, his expression hardening. He reached out, his bloody hand gripping her upper arm. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was an iron trap. "Because right now, I have a man bleeding to death in the back of that Escalade. A bullet nicked his descending aorta. He has maybe 20 minutes before he drowns in his own blood." "Take him to a hospital," she yelled, trying to wrench her arm away. "Take him to Northwestern. They have a top-tier surgical team. If I take him to a hospital, the gunshot wound is reported to the police. The rival family finds out he's vulnerable, and they send someone into the ICU to finish the job," Roman said, his voice dropping an octave, deadly serious. "I am not asking you, Madeline. You are going to get into that car, and you are going to keep my brother alive until we reach my private physician. Do you understand?" "Your brother?" "Matteo," Roman said, a flicker of genuine raw desperation breaking through his icy exterior for a fraction of a second. He is 21 years old. If he dies tonight, I will burn this entire city to the ground. Starting with you. Madeline looked past him. The tinted window of the closest escalade rolled down a few inches. Even from the distance, she could hear the ragged, wet, gurgling sound of a man struggling to pull air into lungs filling with blood. Her medical instincts, the very core of her being, flared to life, drowning out her terror. Attention pneumothorax. The bullet hadn't just hit a vessel, it had collapsed his lung. He's not going to make it 20 minutes, Madeline said, her voice suddenly steady, the panic replaced by the cold, clinical detachment she used to survive the trauma ward. Listen to his breathing. His lung has collapsed. If the pressure isn't relieved right now, his heart will stop in less than 5 minutes. Roman's eyes widened fractionally. He turned to the SUV, then back to her. Can you fix it? I need a medical kit, Madeline demanded, the dynamic instantly shifting. She was no longer a victim pinned against a wall. She was the only authority that mattered in a life-or-death crisis. Betadine, a scalpel, a 1-4, gauge angiocatheter, or a chest tube if you have one, and I need light. Roman snapped his fingers. One of the armed men sprinted to the trunk of the Urus and returned seconds later with a massive, military-grade trauma bag. Get in, Roman ordered, releasing her arm and opening the heavy door of the Escalade. Madeline climbed into the spacious back cabin of the SUV. The luxurious cream leather seats were ruined, completely saturated in dark crimson. Lying across the seats was a young man. He looked remarkably like Roman, but his face was deathly pale, his lips tinged blue, his chest was barely moving, and bloody froth bubbled at his lips. Move, Madeline ordered, shoving past a massive bodyguard who was uselessly pressing a towel against the young man's chest. She ripped open the trauma bag, her hands moving with blinding speed. Matteo, can you hear me? I'm Madeline. I'm going to help you, but it's going to hurt. The young man's eyes rolled back. His pulse was weak, thready, almost gone. Roman leaned into the doorway of the SUV, the heavy rain blowing in behind him. The undisputed king of the Chicago underworld was watching her, his life, his family, entirely in the hands of a disgraced, unemployed nurse he had just pulled off the street. Do it, Roman said softly. Madeline grabbed the scalpel, her hands perfectly steady as she prepared to cut into the chest of a Mafia prince. The interior of the armored Escalade was a chaotic fusion of ultra-luxury and absolute carnage. Madeline knelt on the blood-soaked cream leather, her knees instantly ruined, her mind entirely divorced from the terrifying reality of the men surrounding her. She wasn't a hostage right now. She was the apex predator of the trauma bay, and the Reaper was trying to steal her patient. Flashlight. Now! Madeline barked, not looking up. A heavy, tactical maglite clicked on, held steady by the towering bodyguard whose hands were stained with his young boss's blood. The beam illuminated Matteo's chest. The entrance wound was small, sitting dangerously close to the sternum, just below the collarbone. But the real problem was the massive, asymmetrical swelling on the right side of his chest. His trachea had physically shifted to the left, a textbook catastrophic sign. Tension pneumothorax. Air is trapped in his pleural cavity, crushing his lung and pressing against his heart. His vena cava is kinking off, Madeline said rapidly, her hands ripping open a sterile betadine packet with her teeth. She swiped the dark brown antiseptic across Matteo's pale skin, locating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I need the 1-4, gauge angiocatheter. Roman Castle reached into the trauma bag, his large, blood-stained fingers deftly locating the orange-capped needle. He handed it to her, his dark eyes fixed on her face, searching for any sign of hesitation. He found none. Madeline uncapped the needle. Hold him down. When I puncture the pleura, his body is going to violently react. The massive bodyguard pinned Matteo's shoulders against the leather. Madeline took a breath, angled the needle, and drove it hard into the cartilage and muscle between Matteo's ribs. A sharp, audible hiss ripped through the cabin, like a tire instantly deflating. The trapped air violently escaped the chest cavity, spraying a fine mist of blood onto Madeline's waterproof jacket. Instantly, the terrifying pressure inside Matteo's chest vanished. The young man's eyes flew open, bloodshot and wide with agony, and he sucked in a massive, ragged, desperate breath of air. He's breathing, the bodyguard whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "It's a temporary fix," Madeline said, expertly taping the catheter in place to keep the airway open. She grabbed a heavy gauze pad and pressed it firmly over the entrance wound to seal it. "The needle buys us maybe 15 minutes, but he's still bleeding internally. A piece of shrapnel or the bullet itself grazed a major vessel. If we don't get him on a surgical table and crack his chest open, he will bleed to death into his own stomach cavity. Drive. Now." Roman didn't hesitate. He slammed the heavy door of the Escalade shut and shouted into a sleek, encrypted radio clipped to his lapel. "Move out. Protocol Delta. Get us to the Fulton Market warehouse. No sirens, but run every light." The convoy of heavy, armored supercars roared to life. The Escalade's massive V8 engine surged, throwing Madeline backward as the vehicle launched out of the lower Wacker tunnel. She scrambled forward, wrapping one arm around the passenger headrest to anchor herself, using her other hand to maintain brutal, unyielding pressure on Mateo's chest wound. The tires squealed violently as they navigated the slick, rain-swept streets of downtown Chicago. Through the heavily tinted windows, Madeline watched the blurry neon lights of the city streak past. Roman sat in the jump seat directly across from her. He was wiping the worst of his brother's blood off his hands with a pristine white linen handkerchief, though it was a futile effort. He looked at Madeline, his expression unreadable, calculating. "You didn't flinch," Roman observed, his deep voice slicing through the tense silence of the speeding SUV. "Most civilian doctors freeze when they have a gun in the car and a dying man screaming. You didn't even blink." "I spent 3 years in the ER at Johns Hopkins before coming back to Chicago," Madeline replied, her eyes locked on Mateo's rising and falling chest. "You think you're the first person with a gun and a bleeding friend I've dealt with? You aren't even in the top 10. A faint, grim smirk played at the corner of Roman's mouth. "You're brave, Madeline Hayes. Or foolish. Perhaps both." "Who shot him?" she asked, her medical curiosity momentarily overridden by the sheer insanity of her situation. Roman's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, murderous darkness that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the car. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, deformed piece of metal, wrapped in a tissue. "My men pulled this out of the drywall behind him at the restaurant. It's a 9mm hollow point, but it's not street ammo. It's an expanding round, specifically manufactured by Winchester for the Chicago Police Department's tactical units." Madeline's blood ran cold. "The police shot him?" "A dirty cop on the payroll of the Sullivan family," Roman corrected, his voice dangerously soft. The Sullivans were the Irish mob that controlled the South Side, the castle's oldest, most vicious rivals. The Sullivans are making a play for the shipping docks. They bought off Chief of Surgery Gregory Aris to silence Thomas Sterling, and they bought off a tactical unit to assassinate my brother tonight. Aris firing you wasn't just him covering his tracks. By pinning the fentanyl theft on you, he destroyed your credibility. If you ever went to the press or the FBI about what you saw on Sterling's chart, you'd just look like a disgruntled, drug-addicted employee trying to smear the hospital. The horrifying realization hit Madeline with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just been fired, she had been neutralized by a criminal empire. Her career, her reputation, Chloe's future, it had all been incinerated in a single night just to cover up a Mafia assassination. Before she could process the sheer magnitude of the conspiracy, the Escalade slammed on its brakes, throwing her forward. The heavy steel garage doors of an abandoned-looking meatpacking plant in the Fulton Market district rolled open, swallowing the convoy of black vehicles into the harsh, fluorescent-lit interior. The exterior of the warehouse looked like a derelict relic of Chicago's industrial past, but the interior was a revelation. It was a sprawling, subterranean fortress. Armed men patrolled the catwalks, and the center of the massive room was dominated by a glass-enclosed medical suite that looked cleaner and better equipped than Cook County's $1 million surgical wing. "Get him on the striker," Roman roared as the doors flew open. 4 men instantly hauled Mateo out of the SUV onto a high-end, mobile hospital gurney. Madeline ran alongside them, keeping her hand pressed tightly against his chest, sprinting toward the glass doors of the surgical suite. Inside, a man in his late 50s with unkempt grey hair and a deeply lined face was frantically scrubbing up at a stainless steel sink. Dr. Arthur Vance was a legendary cardiothoracic surgeon who had lost his license a decade ago due to a severe gambling addiction. Now, He was the Cassell family's exclusive, highly paid ghost doctor. He's tachycardic, pressure is crashing, likely a nicked descending aorta, Madeline shouted, rattling off the vitals as they crashed through the doors. I placed a 1-4 gauge in the second intercostal to relieve a tension pneumothorax, but he needs a chest tube and a sternotomy right now. Dr. Vance turned around, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. He looked at Madeline, then at Roman. Who the hell is she? She's the only reason my brother is still breathing, Roman snarled, shrugging off his ruined suit jacket. Scrub in, Madeline. Arthur needs an assist, and his usual nurse is useless under pressure. I am not a surgical nurse. I'm trauma. I don't care, Roman interrupted, stepping into her path. The absolute authority in his eyes left no room for debate. You saved him in the car. You are going to help save him on that table. Go. The next 2 hours were a blur of adrenaline, blood, and the rhythmic, terrifying beep of the Puritan's Bennett ventilator. Madeline fell into the familiar, deeply ingrained rhythm of her training. She anticipated Dr. Vance's needs before he spoke, passing clamps, managing the suction, and monitoring the massive blood transfusions required to keep Matteo alive, while Vance desperately sutured the torn wall of the young man's aorta. It was a flawless, brutal dance of modern medicine. When Vance finally tied off the last suture and stepped back, his scrubs soaked in sweat. The room fell dead silent. The heart monitor beeped a strong, steady, regular rhythm. He's stable, Vance breathed, pulling down his surgical mask. He looked at Madeline with a newfound, profound respect. I couldn't have done that fast enough without you, kid. You've got hands like ice. Madeline didn't smile. She felt entirely hollowed out. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard, her hands finally beginning to shake as she stripped off the bloody latex gloves and tossed them into a biohazard bin. She walked out of the surgical suite and into the adjoining locker room, leaning heavily over a sink to wash her hands. The hot water ran pink down the drain. She stared at her pale, exhausted reflection in the mirror. It was 6:15 a.m. Just 4 hours ago, her biggest problem had been a broken alternator and a stolen career. Now, she had just operated on a Mafia prince in an illegal underground bunker. The heavy locker room door creaked open. Roman stepped inside. He had changed into a clean black button-down shirt, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He walked over to the sink, leaned against the tiled counter, and handed her a pristine white towel. Vance says he's going to make a full recovery, Roman said quietly. The lethal edge in his voice was gone, replaced by something heavier. You have a debt owed to you today, Madeline, and the Cassell family always pays its debts. Madeline took the towel, drying her shaking hands. I don't want your money, Roman. I just want to go home. I want to wake up, call a lawyer, and figure out how to get my life back. Roman looked at her, a shadow of genuine pity crossing his hardened features. You don't understand, do you? Aris didn't just fire you. He marked you. The Sullivans know you saw Sterling's chart. They know you're smart enough to put the pieces together. The only reason they haven't killed you yet is because they thought destroying your career would keep you quiet. Madeline stepped back, the towel dropping from her hands. No, that's insane. I'm just a nurse. You were just a nurse, Roman corrected, stepping closer, his presence entirely consuming the small room. But tonight, you got into my car. My men saw you. The street cameras caught you leaving with my convoy. By noon tomorrow, the Sullivans will know that the nurse they tried to ruin is now under the protection of the Cassell family. If you go back to your apartment in the South Loop, you won't survive the night. Your sister at Northwestern won't survive the week. Madeline couldn't breathe. The walls of the underground bunker felt like they were closing in, crushing her. Are you threatening my sister? I am trying to save her, Roman said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. He reached out, his warm, rough fingers gently tilting her chin up so she was forced to look into his eyes. I am telling you the reality of the world you just stepped into, the world Aris dragged you into. You have two choices, Madeline. He stepped so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, smelling the clean scent of soap and the lingering, metallic tang of gunpowder. You can walk out that door, go to the police, and pray they aren't on the Sullivans' payroll, Roman said softly. Or you can stay. You become my private physician. You live under my roof, under my protection. I will pay your sister's tuition in full, anonymously, for the rest of her academic career. I will ensure she is guarded by my best men without her ever knowing. And in return, you fix my people when they break." Madeline stared at the ruthless, terrifying man standing before her. He was offering her a gilded cage, built on blood and crime. But as she thought about Chloe, and the cold, unyielding power of the men who wanted her dead, she realized the terrifying truth. She didn't have a choice at all. The Castle family estate was a sprawling, historic limestone mansion nestled on Astor Street in Chicago's ultra-exclusive Gold Coast neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like the refined, quiet residence of a billionaire hedge fund manager. Inside, it was a high-tech fortress. Biometric scanners were discreetly built into the mahogany door frames. Bulletproof glass lined the massive bay windows overlooking Lake Michigan, and heavily armed men in tailored suits patrolled the manicured grounds with invisible earpieces. This was Madeline's new reality. 3 weeks had passed since the night on Lower Wacker Drive. True to his word, Roman had moved with terrifying efficiency. Within 24 hours of Matteo's surgery, Madeline's meager belongings had been packed up and moved into a sprawling guest suite on the 3rd floor of the mansion. A massive, anonymous wire transfer from a shell corporation routed through Chase Bank had cleared Chloe's entire undergraduate and medical school tuition at Northwestern University. Roman had even orchestrated a shadow security detail for Chloe, 2 former Navy SEALs who posed as campus security and a barista at her favorite coffee shop. Chloe was completely oblivious, safe in her academic bubble, believing her sister had simply landed a high-paying private nursing gig for a wealthy eccentric. Madeline, however, was keenly aware of the invisible bars on her gilded cage. She spent her days in the estate's sprawling basement, which Roman had gutted and transformed into a state-of-the-art trauma clinic. Unboxing crates of the latest diagnostic equipment, sterilization autoclaves, and enough surgical supplies to run a small hospital, Madeline threw herself into the work to keep her mind from spiraling. She was no longer just a nurse. She was the chief medical officer of a criminal syndicate. Matteo was her primary patient. The young Mafia prince was recovering astonishingly fast from the gunshot wound, his youth and stubbornness pushing him through the grueling physical therapy Madeline mandated. "You're pushing too hard, Matteo," Madeline scolded one Tuesday afternoon, watching the 21-year-old wince as he tried to lift a 10-pound dumbbell. "I have to get back on the streets, Maddie," Matteo grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "The Sullivans are getting bold. They hit a warehouse near O'Hare last night. Roman is handling it all himself, and he's not sleeping." Madeline paused, her hands resting on the stainless steel examination table. She hadn't seen Roman in 4 days. When she did see him, it was only in passing, a dark, brooding phantom moving through the corridors of the mansion, always flanked by his top lieutenants, a heavy aura of violence radiating from him. "Roman is a grown man. He can handle himself," Madeline said, though a strange, unfamiliar knot tightened in her chest at the thought of him in danger. "Your sternum is still healing. If you tear those internal sutures, I'm going to have Arthur crack your chest open again without anesthesia. Put the weight down." Matteo chuckled, dropping the dumbbell onto the padded mat. "You know, you're the only person in this entire city who talks to a castle like that and lives to tell the tale." "I'm a medical professional," Madeline replied coolly, checking his vitals on the monitor. "Viruses and bullets don't care about your last name, and neither do I." "Roman likes it, you know," Matteo said quietly, a knowing glint in his dark eyes. Madeline froze, her heart skipping a treacherous beat. "Excuse me? The way you don't flinch around him," Matteo clarified, sitting up and pulling his t-shirt over his scarred chest. "Everyone else in his life is either terrified of him or trying to kill him. You just look at him, like he's a normal person." "He's not a normal person, Matteo. He's a crime boss holding me hostage," she replied, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He's protecting you," Matteo corrected gently. "If he just wanted a doctor, he could have hired 10 of them. He brought you into our home, Maddie. He put you under his personal umbrella. That means something in our world." Before Madeline could process the heavy implication of Matteo's words, the heavy reinforced steel door to the clinic buzzed and violently swung open. 3 men rushed in, supporting a massive, familiar figure between them. It was Roman. His charcoal suit jacket was ruined, and his crisp white shirt was soaked in a fresh, terrifying bloom of crimson blood, spreading across his left bicep and shoulder. Madeline's breath hitched, the casual conversation instantly vaporizing. "Get him on the table, now," she commanded, her voice slicing through the chaos. The lieutenants hauled Roman onto the examination table. He was breathing heavily, his jaw locked in a tight, furious line, but his eyes were clear. "Out," Roman growled at his men, his voice a gravelly command that brooked no argument. "All of you, leave." The men hesitated, glancing at Madeline, before turning and marching out of the clinic, the heavy steel door sealing behind them with a definitive thud. Matteo lingered for a second, gave Madeline a tight nod, and slipped out as well. Suddenly, the massive room felt incredibly small. Madeline grabbed a pair of trauma shears and stepped up to the table. "I have to cut the shirt, Roman." "Do it," he hissed, his head falling back against the leather headrest. She sliced through the expensive Egyptian cotton, peeling the ruined fabric away to reveal his deeply tanned, heavily muscled torso. Her breath caught, not just from the jagged, bleeding laceration across his upper arm, but from the landscape of old, faded scars that mapped his skin. Bullet grazes, knife wounds, burns. He was a living testament to a life built on surviving brutal, unrelenting violence. "It's a ricochet," Madeline assessed, her professional detachment struggling to override the sudden, wild hammering of her pulse. She moved quickly, prepping a tray with betadine, lidocaine, and proline sutures. The bullet didn't lodge, but it tore through the muscle fascia. "You're going to need at least 20 stitches. Just patch it up, Madeline. I have to be back at the Navy Pier docks in an hour," Roman said, trying to sit up. Madeline put a firm, unyielding hand on his uninjured shoulder, shoving him back down against the table. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, but she didn't let go. "You aren't going anywhere," she said fiercely, locking eyes with him. "If you move your arm right now, you'll sever the cephalic vein, and you will bleed out in the back of your car before you even reach the Eisenhower Expressway. You sit still, or I swear to God, I will sedate you." Roman stared at her. For a long, agonizing moment, the air between them crackled with a heavy, dangerous tension. He was a man used to absolute obedience, a king who held the lives of thousands in his blood-stained hands. Yet, under the fierce, blazing glare of his captive nurse, the tension slowly drained out of his rigid muscles. He let out a harsh breath and leaned back. "Fine, do your job." Madeline filled a syringe with lidocaine. "This will burn." She worked in silence, her hands moving with practiced, graceful precision. As she cleaned the wound and began threading the needle through his torn flesh, the physical proximity between them became suffocating. She was leaning over him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin, close enough to smell the intoxicating blend of his bergamot cologne, adrenaline, and gunpowder. Roman didn't take his eyes off her. He watched the intense concentration on her face, the way her dark hair fell over her shoulder, the soft, unintentional furrow between her brows. "The Sullivans made a move on one of our front companies," Roman said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was lower, rougher than usual. "They thought I wouldn't be there." "They were wrong," Madeline murmured, tying off a knot. "I killed 3 of them tonight, Madeline," he stated, a brutal confession hanging heavy in the sterile air of the clinic. He was testing her, waiting for the disgust, the recoil. Madeline paused, the bloody needle suspended in her hand. She looked down at him. She should be terrified. She should be sickened by the monster lying on her table. But when she looked into his dark eyes, she didn't see a monster. She saw a profoundly exhausted man who was carrying the weight of a violent empire on his broken shoulders to protect the people he loved. "I know what you are, Roman," she said softly, her voice steady. "But I also know that if you hadn't pulled me off Lower Wacker Drive, Dr. Aris and the Sullivans would have silenced me permanently. You killed 3 men tonight. But you saved my sister. You saved me." Roman's hand moved with lightning speed, his large fingers gently wrapping around her wrist, stopping her movements entirely. His thumb brushed against her erratic pulse point. "You shouldn't look at me like that," Roman whispered, the raw, unfiltered hunger in his eyes completely undisguised. "You should run from me, Madeline. You should hate me for trapping you in this life." "Maybe I should," she breathed, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. She couldn't look away. The gravitational pull of the man was undeniable, a dark, consuming fire that threatened to burn her to ash. "But I don't." Roman groaned, a deep, guttural sound, and his uninjured arm snaked around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. His lips crashed down on hers, effectively silencing any protest she might have had. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, bruising collision of adrenaline, fear, and weeks of unbearable tension. Madeline's hands instinctively tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck, the sterile environment of the trauma clinic fading into oblivion. She tasted copper, mint, and the dangerous, intoxicating reality of the man who had turned her life upside down. Roman pulled back just a fraction of an inch, his chest heaving, his dark eyes burning into hers. "When I finish this war, Madeline," he rasped, his voice trembling with a terrifying sincerity, "you are going to tell me exactly what you want, and I will give you the world, or I will let you walk away. But until then, you stay behind these walls." He didn't wait for her answer. He slipped off the table, wincing only slightly as the fresh sutures pulled tight against his skin, and threw a clean black t-shirt over his broad shoulders. Before Madeline could process the seismic shift between them, the heavy steel doors burst open again. It was Silas, Roman's second in command, holding a decrypted tablet. "Boss," Silas said, ignoring the heavy, charged atmosphere in the room. "We got him, Liam Sullivan, and he isn't alone. He's meeting with Dr. Gregory Aris in 40 minutes. Madeline's blood ran ice-cold at the sound of the surgeon's name. "Where?" "Aris's private cosmetic clinic on Michigan Avenue," Silas replied grimly. "Sullivan is using Aris's clinic as a distribution hub for the fentanyl Aris stole from Cook County. They're liquidating the supply tonight to buy illegal arms from a cartel connect. It's their last desperate play to take the docks." Roman's face turned into a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. He grabbed his shoulder holster from a nearby chair, sliding a custom 1911 pistol into the leather. "Gather the tactical team. We end the Sullivans tonight." "I'm coming with you," Madeline blurted out, surprising even herself. Roman stopped dead in his tracks. "Absolutely not. You need me," Madeline argued, her voice gaining strength, the trauma nurse replacing the terrified captive. "Aris's private clinic is a fortress. He caters to billionaires and politicians. The surgical wing has a biometric secondary lock that triggers a silent alarm if forced. Silas's men can't hack it without tripping the CPD response." "And you can?" Roman challenged, his eyes narrowing. "Aris is arrogant. He uses the exact same proprietary medtech security software that Cook County uses for its Level 3 dispensaries," Madeline explained rapidly, her mind racing. "I still have my master override code embedded in my phone. I can bypass the silent alarm, but I have to physically plug into the terminal. If you go in guns blazing, Aris will wipe the servers and destroy the evidence that he framed me and murdered Thomas Sterling. I want my life back, Roman, and he is the only one who can give it to me." Roman stared at her, the brutal calculus of a mob boss weighing against the protective instincts of a man rapidly falling for her. He gave a sharp, definitive nod. "You stay behind, Silas. You do exactly what I say. If you deviate for a single second, I will throw you over my shoulder and carry you out myself." 30 minutes later, the glittering facade of the Magnificent Mile was a blur as the Cassell convoy descended upon the alleyway behind the elite cosmetic clinic. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Chicago streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. Madeline's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she followed Roman and his heavily armed men through the subterranean loading dock. The infiltration was a masterclass in lethal silence. Silas and 2 operatives dispatched the Sullivan guards with suppressed weapons, the muffled thwip sounds echoing softly in the concrete corridor. They reached the heavy reinforced doors of the surgical wing. Madeline stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled out her phone, connecting a jumper cable to the biometric keypad. She typed in her override sequence. A agonizing 10 seconds passed before the light on the panel shifted from angry red to a welcoming green. The heavy lock clicked open. Roman kicked the doors wide. Chaos erupted. The opulent, marble-floored lobby of the surgical suite was instantly transformed into a war zone. Madeline pressed her back against the cold wall, covering her ears as deafening gunfire shattered the glass partitions. Roman moved like a shadow, ruthlessly precise. Liam Sullivan, the head of the rival family, didn't even have time to draw his weapon before Roman put 2 rounds into his chest, dropping him instantly onto the expensive Persian rug. "Clear!" Silas yelled, securing the perimeter. Roman didn't stop. He stalked down the hallway toward the lavish chief executive office, kicking the mahogany doors completely off their hinges. Madeline followed cautiously, stepping over the shattered glass. Inside the office, Dr. Gregory Aris was cowering behind a massive oak desk, clutching a leather briefcase overflowing with banded stacks of $100 bills. The arrogant, untouchable chief of surgery looked utterly pathetic, his expensive suit stained with sweat and terror. Roman crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbing Aris by the collar and violently hauling him over the desk. He threw the doctor onto the floor at Madeline's feet. Aris looked up, his eyes widening in pure shock. "Madeline? What? What are you doing with them? You're a nurse." "Not anymore," Madeline said, her voice dripping with an icy disdain she didn't know she possessed. She looked down at the man who had ruined her life, who had killed patients for profit, and felt absolutely nothing but contempt. Roman pressed the hot muzzle of his pistol against the back of Aris's head. "You have exactly 2 minutes to log into your hospital mainframe, draft a formal confession to the medical board, detailing your theft of the fentanyl and the murder of Thomas Sterling, and formally exonerate Madeline Hayes. If you don't, I will paint this beautiful marble floor with your brains." Trembling violently, Aris scrambled to his laptop. His bloody fingers flew across the keyboard. Within 90 seconds, the email was drafted, signed with his digital signature, and sent directly to the Illinois Board of Nursing, the Chicago Police Department, and the FBI. "It's done," Aris sobbed, putting his hands in the air. "I sent it. She's cleared. You have your license back. Please, just let me go." Madeline looked at the sent confirmation on the screen. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been crushing her chest for a month finally vanished. She was free. She could walk out of this clinic, go back to her small apartment in the South Loop, and resume her life-saving strangers in a chaotic ER. She turned to look at Roman. He was staring at her, his weapon still drawn, his expression completely unreadable. He was giving her the choice he promised. The gilded cage was open. Madeline looked back at Aris, then down at the blood staining her white sneakers. She thought about the adrenaline, the fierce, unyielding loyalty of the men she had saved, and the terrifying, consuming fire in Roman's eyes. Her old life felt small, fragile, meaningless. "Silas," Madeline said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "Take his laptop. Make sure the files are backed up." She turned away from Aris and walked straight to Roman, placing her hand gently over his gun, lowering it. "He's not worth the bullet, Roman. The FBI will have him in custody by morning. Let him rot in a federal cell." Roman's dark eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of hesitation. "You're cleared, Madeline. You can walk out that door right now, and I will never bother you again." Madeline stepped closer, reaching up to gently touch the pristine bandage covering his wounded shoulder. "Who is going to take your stitches out next week, if I leave?" A slow, devastating smirk spread across Roman's face, changing his entire demeanor. He holstered his weapon, wrapping his good arm around her waist and pulling her tight against him, right there in the ruins of their enemy's empire. She wasn't just a captive nurse anymore. She was exactly where she belonged. If you love this intense, pulse-pounding Mafia romance, don't forget to hit that like button and share this story with anyone who craves high-stakes drama, unexpected plot twists, and a heroine who refuses to back down. Madeline's journey from a wrongfully terminated, desperate trauma nurse to the undisputed queen and medical mastermind of Chicago's most powerful syndicate is proof that sometimes the darkest nights lead to the most powerful awakenings. Will Roman and Madeline's new empire survive the inevitable retaliation from the FBI, or is their dangerous love story just beginning? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter of our thrilling, real-life-inspired storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have chosen the safe, normal hospital life or the dangerous thrill of the Castle family? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next video.